The morning my wife handed me a glass of fresh squeezed orange juice, kissed me on the cheek, and told me she loved me, I already knew she had been lying to my face for 11 months. I didn't flinch. I didn't say a word. I just smiled, took a sip, and set the glass down on the kitchen counter like everything was fine. Because in my line of work, you learn something very early. The moment you show your hand is the moment you lose. My name is Clifton Hargrove. For 31 years, I sat on the federal bench in Richmond, Virginia. I presided over fraud cases worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I watched prosecutors unravel conspiracies that had taken years to build. I saw defendants who were certain they were untouchable walk into my courtroom and never walk out free again. I watched men cry. I watched women lie. I watched entire families implode on the witness stand. And I thought, after all those decades, that I was immune to that kind of devastation. I was wrong. Because nothing in 31 years on the bench prepared me for the morning I sat at the kitchen table in our home on Monument Avenue, looking at my wife of 22 years across the breakfast table, and knowing with absolute certainty that the woman smiling at me was not the woman I had married. But here is what I want you to understand before I tell you what happened next. I did not explode. I did not confront her. I did not pick up the phone and call her out in front of her daughter, her mother, or the so-called elite attorney she had already quietly retained. I did something far more powerful. I waited. And if you stay with me through this story, you are going to understand exactly why waiting was the most devastating thing I could have done. And you are going to understand why, when that attorney walked into a conference room 3 weeks later with a smirk on his face, the smirk lasted exactly 4 minutes before it disappeared forever. Before we continue, subscribe if you enjoy stories like this. And in the comments, tell me where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. I retired from the bench 2 years ago in the spring at the age of 57. I had reached a point where I wanted to breathe again. 31 years of other people's crises had taken a toll I didn't fully acknowledge until I stopped showing up to work and realized I had forgotten what silence felt like. Rosalind had been pushing for the retirement for 2 years before I finally agreed. She said she wanted to travel. She said she wanted us to have mornings that weren't defined by alarm clocks and case files. She painted this picture of what our life could look like, the two of us driving up to Charlottesville on a Tuesday just because we felt like it, spending a long weekend in Annapolis, maybe finally taking that trip to Portugal she had been talking about since our 15th anniversary. It sounded beautiful. I believed her. Rosalind was 53 when I retired. She was still stunning in the way some women are at that age, the kind of beauty that has settled into itself and become something more serious than youth. She had worked as an interior designer for 20 years, building a client list that included some of the most prominent homes in the Fan District and the West End of Richmond. She was good at it. She had a gift for understanding what people actually wanted, even when they couldn't articulate it themselves. She had taste, and she had patience, and she had the ability to make every client feel like they were the only one that mattered. I know now that those skills extended well beyond her professional life. We had one daughter together, Priya, who was 26 when all of this started. Priya worked in marketing for a real estate development firm in Northern Virginia, and she drove down to Richmond about once a month for Sunday dinner. She was sharp, ambitious, and devoted to her mother in a way I had always admired. They were close in the way some mothers and daughters are, a unit unto themselves, with their own language and their own way of moving through the world that didn't always leave room for anyone else. I had always told myself that was just how it was between mothers and daughters. I told myself I didn't take it personally. That was one of the many things I was wrong about. The first crack appeared in October, about 14 months after I retired. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a lipstick stain on a collar or a hotel receipt falling out of a pocket. It was a feeling, a shift in atmospheric pressure so slight that most people would have dismissed it as paranoia. Rosalind had always been a communicative person. She talked through her day over dinner. She called me when she was between appointments just to check in. She had a habit of narrating her life in real time that I had found endearing for 20 years and occasionally exhausting, but always reassuring in the way that constant, familiar noise is reassuring. And then, sometime in early October, she went quiet. Not distant exactly. She was still warm, still attentive in the ways that are easy to perform. She still asked about my day, still laughed at my jokes, still reached for my hand in the car. But the narration stopped. The spontaneous phone calls dried up. The way she carried her phone changed. It went from casually present to deliberately managed, face down on the counter, screen brightness turned low, taken into the bathroom in a way that had never happened before. I noticed. I said nothing. I am a man who spent 3 decades building federal cases, and I understand that the worst thing you can do with incomplete evidence is act on it. So I watched. I kept my face neutral. I kept my voice warm. I kept my eyes open. By November, I had what I needed. Her schedule had developed gaps I couldn't account for. On Tuesdays and Thursdays, she was supposedly meeting clients, but when I casually mentioned projects she should have been working on, she answered in the vague, general terms of someone who was recalling a cover story rather than reporting actual experience. On 2 occasions, she came home wearing a perfume I didn't recognize, floral and heavier than what she normally wore, the kind of scent that clings to your clothes when you've been somewhere close to someone. I'm not a private investigator. I'm a federal judge. But I know how to find people. His name was Bradley Sutton, 44 years old, divorced. He ran a small boutique architecture firm out of a renovated Victorian on Broad Street, and Rosalind had been introduced to him through a mutual client 18 months earlier. He was exactly the kind of man I might have predicted if I had let myself predict anything. Younger than me, professionally adjacent to her world, aesthetically polished in the way that impresses people who care about that kind of thing. I found out everything I needed to know in the span of about a week. I hired a private investigator named Davis Kelleher, a former Henrico County detective who had worked fraud cases I'd overseen years ago. He was discreet, thorough, and genuinely uncomfortable delivering his report to me. "Judge," he said, because old habits die hard, "I'm sorry. It's been going on for about 11 months. 11 months. That took me back to the winter. The last Christmas we had spent as what I believed was a real family. The dinner I had hosted for Rosalind's sister and brother-in-law. The New Year's Eve we had spent with friends at a farmhouse in Goochland County. All of it was already happening then. All of it had been a performance. I sat with that information for 6 days before I made a single move. 6 days is a long time to sit across from someone at a breakfast table and watch them pour your orange juice. 6 days is a long time to hear someone say, "I love you," as they leave for an appointment and understand precisely what that word has become in their mouth. But those 6 days were necessary, because I needed to understand the full picture before I drew any conclusions. What I discovered during those 6 days was this. Rosalind had not just been conducting an affair. She had also been quietly restructuring her finances. I noticed it first through a statement that came to the house, a minor administrative notice from a brokerage account I hadn't thought about in months. A transfer had been made, small enough to look routine, large enough to matter if you were paying attention. I started paying attention. With the help of my attorney, a woman named Geraldine Osei, who had been practicing family law in Richmond for over 20 years, and who I trusted completely, we began to trace the full financial landscape. What we found was methodical and careful and unmistakably intentional. Over the course of approximately 8 months, Rosalind had moved roughly $340,000 out of jointly held accounts and into accounts that bore only her name. The transfers had been structured to remain below certain reporting thresholds, staggered across different institutions. She had done this with the precision of someone who had been advised, which meant she had already seen a lawyer, which meant this had been planned far longer than I had realized. When Geraldine laid out the documentation on her conference table, she looked at me with the expression of someone who is trying to deliver news professionally and is struggling not to simply say, "I'm sorry." "Clifton," she said, "whoever is advising her is good. This is not amateur work." "I know," I said, "so let's be better." That was when I made the first of several decisions that would eventually cause Rosalind's attorney to stand up from a conference table with his face the color of old chalk. But I need to tell you about Priya first, because Priya is the part of this story that still sits with me in ways I did not expect. I had always been close to my daughter, or I believed I had been. We had our differences. She was more like Rosalind in temperament. Social, expressive, comfortable in rooms full of people in ways I never entirely was. But she was also perceptive and fair-minded in ways I respected enormously. She was not a person I would have predicted capable of what she did. I found out about it on a Thursday afternoon in December, 6 weeks after I had first confirmed what was happening. I had driven up to her apartment in Alexandria for what she had described as a surprise early birthday lunch. She had sounded warm on the phone, genuine, and I had been looking forward to it. We met at a Thai restaurant near her building that she had been talking about for months. Lunch was fine. It was normal. We talked about her work, about a project she was managing, about the holidays. And then, as we were waiting for the check, she reached across the table and put her hand on mine in the way she did when she was about to say something she had prepared. "Dad," she said, "I need to tell you something." And then she told me that she knew about her mother's relationship with Bradley Sutton, that she had known for 7 months, that she had in fact met Bradley several times and that she liked him, and that she thought her mother deserved happiness, and that she hoped I would eventually understand that sometimes marriages simply ran their course. She said this to me, her father, the man who had not yet said a single word to anyone in the family about what I knew. She didn't realize that. I sat there for a moment, very still, the way I used to sit on the bench when someone said something in open court that revealed far more than they intended. And then I asked her, very calmly, whether she had been aware that her mother had also been restructuring the family's finances for the better part of a year. She blinked. "What do you mean, restructuring?" "I mean moving money, Priya. Significant amounts of it." She shook her head quickly, the way people do when they want to reject information before they've processed it. "That's not... Dad, I think you might be misreading things. Mom wouldn't... How many times have you met Bradley Sutton?" A pause. "A few times." "Has your mother ever discussed with you what she intends to do with the house? With the accounts?" Another pause, longer. "She mentioned that she'd been thinking about things, about what the next chapter might look like. She mentioned talking to someone." "An attorney?" The look on Priya's face in that moment told me everything I needed to know. She hadn't known about the finances, but she had known enough. She had known her mother was planning to leave, and she had been prepared to support her in it, and she had not said a single word to me. I paid the check. I hugged my daughter at the door. I told her I loved her. And I drove back to Richmond in silence, understanding that the circle of people Rosalind had brought into her plan was larger than I had thought. That was the moment I decided to stop waiting and start moving. I filed for divorce on a Monday morning in January. I did not tell Rosalind it was coming. I did not have a dramatic conversation the night before. I did not give a speech over dinner. I left the house at 8:30 in the morning as though I were going to my regular Tuesday breakfast at a diner on Carey Street, and instead I drove to Geraldine's office and signed the papers. Rosalind was served at home at 11:15 that same morning. The process server knocked on the front door while she was on a call with a client. She had to excuse herself from the call. I know this because I was parked 2 blocks away and Geraldine's assistant had confirmed the service. I drove to my brother's house in Chesterfield that afternoon. My brother Leonard, 4 years older than me, a man who had been quietly furious on my behalf since I had told him the full story 3 weeks earlier. He had prepared a room for me without being asked. He didn't say much when I arrived, just handed me a cup of coffee and sat down across from me at the kitchen table. "It's done?" he said. "It's done," I said. What happened next moved faster than I expected, but not in the direction Rosalind had anticipated. Her attorney was a man named Graham Fielding. He was 51 years old, a partner at a firm on East Main Street that handled high-asset divorces and prenuptial disputes for Richmond's professional class. He was good at his job in the way that certain attorneys are. He was aggressive, he was confident, and he was accustomed to winning because he was accustomed to having clients with significant resources and a clear upper hand. He had, I would later learn, told Rosalind that she was in an excellent position, that the financial transfers, while potentially problematic, were defensible, that a retired judge would be reluctant to take an ugly public battle to court, that the most likely outcome was a swift and lucrative settlement. He had told her, apparently, that I would want to avoid the embarrassment. He had badly misjudged who I was. The first meeting between our attorneys took place without either of us present. Geraldine told me afterward that Fielding had opened with a settlement figure that was so optimistic she had needed a moment to make sure she hadn't misread the room. "He came in expecting to negotiate," Geraldine said. "He came in expecting us to be defensive." "And?" I said. And I told him we weren't settling, that we were prepared to pursue discovery on every financial transaction made in the past 3 years, that we had documentation of the transfers, and that we intended to characterize them as dissipation of marital assets. Fielding had apparently taken this well in the moment. He was experienced enough not to show his cards immediately, but Geraldine said there was a flicker of something behind his professional composure, a recognition that this was not the negotiation he had prepared for. What he had not yet been told was the second part of what we had prepared. You need to understand something about Richmond, Virginia, and about the circles that Rosalind had spent 20 years moving through. She was connected. Interior design for wealthy clients means you become a fixture in a certain kind of social landscape. You get invited to the right events. You know the right people. You develop the reputation of being someone whose taste can be trusted. I had always been somewhat peripheral to those circles. My world was the courtroom, the law, the rigorous structure of legal procedure. I was respected in those rooms, but I was not, in the way Rosalind was, embedded in the social fabric of Richmond's philanthropic and creative class. What Rosalind did not know, and what I had never made a point of advertising, was what I had accumulated during 31 years on the federal bench. My personal estate, separate from anything jointly held, had been carefully and quietly managed since before we were married. My grandfather had left me land outside of Fredericksburg. My father had left me investments that had matured quietly over 4 decades. I had been careful with my federal salary, and more careful with what I inherited. And for 30 years, the value of what I held independently had grown in ways that I had never discussed at dinner parties, or mentioned in conversation with people I didn't entirely trust. Rosalind had known, in a general sense, that I was financially comfortable. She had not known the specifics. That was not an accident. In the aftermath of my retirement, when she had presumably begun consulting with Fielding about what a divorce would look like, she had apparently concluded that the jointly held marital assets were the primary prize, and that the transfers she had made gave her a significant head start in claiming them. She had not known about the estate. She had not known about the will. And she had not known that 4 weeks before the divorce was filed, I had visited my estate attorney, a quiet and precise man named Harold Whitman, who had been managing my family's affairs for 18 years, and I had done something very straightforward. I had rewritten my will. The conference room at Geraldine's firm seated 12 people around a long mahogany table. On the morning of our first formal 4-way meeting, it held 6. Geraldine and her associate on one side, Fielding and his associate on the other, and then Rosalind and me, seated at opposite ends of the table. I had not seen Rosalind since the morning the papers were served. That had been 6 weeks ago. She looked the way I expected her to look, composed on the surface, with the effort of that composure visible just beneath it. She was dressed carefully, the way she always dressed for important occasions, with the eye of a woman who understood how presentation functions as communication. She had chosen well. She looked like a woman with dignity, and I understood that was intentional, because she believed she was walking into a room where the goal was to demonstrate that she deserved a generous settlement. She smiled at me when I sat down. It was the careful, civil smile of 2 adults who are being professional about a painful situation. I nodded. Fielding opened the meeting by restating the settlement position he had communicated to Geraldine, a division of jointly held assets that was structured in a way that, on paper, appeared roughly equal, but was, when you accounted for the prior transfers and certain valuations Fielding had elected to characterize more favorably to Rosalind's side, significantly skewed. He was polished about it. I'll give him that. He had the practiced confidence of someone who had delivered this kind of proposal many times and expected it to be the beginning of a productive negotiation. Geraldine listened without expression. When he finished, she opened the folder in front of her. "We appreciate the proposal," she said. "We're declining it, and I'd like to walk through why, so that we can have a substantive conversation about what an actual resolution looks like." What followed was 45 minutes of Geraldine laying out, in meticulous and unhurried detail, the documentation we had compiled. The financial transfers, traced and time-stamped and characterized specifically as dissipation under Virginia law. The timeline, which established clearly that the transfers had begun months before any discussion of divorce, and were therefore not preparatory but strategic. The pattern of behavior that demonstrated these were not innocent account management decisions. Fielding's composure held through most of it. He interjected periodically with objections and alternative characterizations, and some of them were legitimate, because he was a good attorney and he had done his preparation. But I could see, across the long table, that Rosalind was absorbing the documentation with an expression that was becoming harder to maintain. And then Geraldine reached the second section of her folder. "We also need to discuss the question of Mr. Hargrove's independent estate," she said, "which is not a marital asset and is therefore not subject to division in these proceedings. But it is relevant to the question of what a final agreement should reflect." Fielding frowned. "We haven't been provided with documentation on any independent estate." "We're providing it now," Geraldine said. She slid a single summary document across the table. I watched Fielding pick it up. I watched his eyes move down the page. I watched his associate lean over slightly to see what he was looking at. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Fielding set the document down and looked at me directly for the first time. "And this estate," he said, "has been recently restructured?" "4 weeks ago," I said. "May I ask in what way?" "You may ask Harold Whitman, who is my estate attorney. He'll confirm that I've updated my will and adjusted the beneficiary designations on the independent assets. Those changes are complete and properly executed." Another pause. Rosalind had gone very still at the other end of the table. "And the beneficiaries of the revised will," Fielding said carefully, "are various charitable organizations," I said, "and my brother, and a scholarship fund I've established at the University of Richmond School of Law." Fielding set down his pen. He looked at Rosalind. He looked back at me, and then, very carefully, he said, "Mr. Hargrove, do you understand the magnitude of what you're describing?" "I was a federal judge for 31 years, I said. "I have a reasonable grasp of magnitude." The silence that followed was the kind of silence I used to let sit in a courtroom when a witness had said something that required the full room to absorb its weight. Rosalind's composure broke first. Not dramatically. She didn't cry and she didn't raise her voice, but her hands, which had been folded neatly on the table in front of her, tightened, and her jaw set in a way I recognized, and for just a moment, the performance slipped. Fielding asked for a brief recess. What happened in that recess, I was not present for. But Geraldine, who had excellent instincts about what was happening in adjacent rooms, told me afterward that the dynamic between Rosalind and Fielding had shifted significantly. The confident, well-prepared client who had walked into the conference room believing she held the stronger position was now confronting a reality that had not been part of the plan. The plan, as Fielding had presumably outlined it, had been built on a foundation that assumed the marital assets were the primary prize. The transfers she had made were head start. The affair, if it became relevant, was a complication but not a fatal one in Virginia, which is a no-fault divorce state. She had been advised that she was positioned well. What neither she nor Fielding had known was that the marital assets, substantial as they were not the largest component of what I held. And what they had further not known was that I had no intention of negotiating from a position of wanting to protect or share that independent estate with someone who had spent 11 months lying to my face. When they came back to the table, Fielding's tone had changed. The opening confidence had been replaced by something more careful, more measured. "My client would like to revisit the settlement framework," he said. "That's a good idea," Geraldine said pleasantly. The final agreement took another 8 weeks to negotiate. I will not tell you that I walked away unscathed, because that would not be true. 22 years of shared life does not dissolve without cost. There were moments in those 8 weeks that were hard in ways I had not fully prepared for. Not because I doubted my decisions, but because grief does not require doubt in order to arrive. You can know with complete clarity that something is over and still feel the weight of what it was. But I also want to tell you what I felt on the morning the final papers were signed. I drove home from Geraldine's office along the boulevard, through the neighborhood I had lived in for 16 years, past the old neighborhoods of Richmond that I had known my entire adult life. The trees along Monument Avenue were beginning to show the first gray-green of early spring. The light was doing what Richmond light does in March, low and clear and unexpectedly beautiful. I felt, underneath everything, a remarkable quiet. The financial transfers Rosalind had made were accounted for in the final agreement and largely offset in the settlement structure. She received her fair share of the jointly held marital assets, properly valued. She did not receive anything from the independent estate, because that was never a marital asset. She did not receive the house on Monument Avenue, which I retained. Bradley Sutton, as far as I was aware, welcomed her with whatever he had prepared for this chapter of her life. I genuinely hope it is what she was looking for. I mean that without sarcasm. I mean it the way you mean things when you have moved far enough past the wound that you can afford to be generous. She made choices that destroyed our marriage, but she is still a person I spent 22 years building a life with, and I am not a man who wants to carry hatred. It is too heavy, and I have spent too many years watching what it does to people. Priya and I have had several conversations since the divorce was finalized. They have not been easy conversations. There is something very particular about the hurt of discovering that your child chose a side before they knew all the sides, and that the side they chose was the one that did not include you. But I also understand that she was in an impossible position, and that loyalty to a mother is not a moral failing, and that the shape of her understanding changed significantly when she learned what had been happening with the finances. We are not where we were. but we are talking, and that is something I am choosing to hold on to. Several people have asked me, in the months since all of this became known, whether I regret anything, whether I would have done something differently, whether the calculated way I handled things, the patience, the documentation, the legal precision, was the right approach, or whether I should have simply confronted Rosalind in the kitchen on the first morning I knew the truth. I think about that question seriously, because it deserves a serious answer. What I know is this: the truth was going to come out regardless. Affairs end. Financial schemes get discovered. The elaborate architecture of a well-maintained deception eventually shows its seams. The only question was whether the truth came out on her terms or on mine. I chose mine, not out of vengeance, though I will be honest and tell you that the look on Graham Fielding's face when he read that estate summary was not entirely unpleasant to witness, but primarily because I had spent 31 years in a system built on the premise that evidence matters, that documentation matters, that you do not act on incomplete information, and that the person who is prepared before the storm arrives is almost always better positioned than the person who reacts to the storm after it has already begun. I am a man who has watched too many people walk into courtrooms unprepared. I was not going to be one of them. The scholarship fund at the University of Richmond School of Law is called the Hargrove Foundation for Ethical Practice. It goes to second-year students who have demonstrated both academic excellence and a documented commitment to pro bono work. The first recipient was a young woman from Roanoke who had worked her way through college and was paying for law school through a combination of loans and part-time work. Her name is Tessa. She wrote me a letter after she found out about the scholarship. She said that when she first started law school, she had worried that the cost of the degree would force her to take whatever work paid best rather than the work she actually cared about, and that knowing the scholarship existed had changed something in how she thought about the next 3 years. I keep that letter on the desk in my study. The study is in the house on Monument Avenue, which is mine now, which is quiet in the mornings in ways I am still learning to inhabit. I make my own coffee. I read case law sometimes, not because I have to, but because old habits are harder to shed than I expected. I drive out to Fredericksburg once a month to walk the land my grandfather left me. I am learning what it means to be 60 years old and starting a chapter I did not plan for. It is not what I expected. Very little worth having is. Here is what I want to leave you with. There are moments in a life when the ground shifts beneath you without warning, when the things you were certain of reveal themselves to have been something else entirely, and when the version of yourself that existed before that moment has to reckon with the version that exists after. Those moments are terrible. I will not tell you otherwise. But they are also, if you are paying attention, instructive in ways nothing else is. They show you who the people around you actually are. They show you what you are made of under conditions that are specifically designed to break it. And they show you, if you are willing to look, exactly what you have been carrying without knowing it, waiting for the right moment of pressure to reveal itself. The morning Rosalind handed me that orange juice and told me she loved me, 11 months into a deception I had not yet named, she did not know she was also handing me the clarity I needed to understand exactly what the rest of my life was supposed to look like. I drank the orange juice. I set down the glass, and I waited until I was ready. You know what hit me hardest about Clifton's story? It wasn't the affair. It wasn't even the money. It was the patience. Most of us, the second we feel betrayed, we explode, we confront, we make it messy. And honestly, that's exactly what the other person is counting on. Clifton did the opposite. He got quiet. He got prepared. And when he finally moved, it was over before she even knew the game had started. That's not coldness. That's clarity. And I think there's something in that for all of us, whether it's a marriage, a friendship, or a business situation. The person who controls their reaction usually controls the outcome. Anyway, I want to hear from you. Drop a comment below. Would you have been able to wait that long, or would you have said something the very first morning you knew? And if this one got to you, subscribe. I put out stories like this every week, and trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next.